Earlier this week, I spoke to a gal who had a concussion a number of years back and has been struggling mainly with headaches ever since. She tells me all about the accident, what her headaches feel like, what makes them feel better and worse, and then based on all of that information, I begin going into a detailed explanation of what I feel like could potentially be the mechanism behind her headaches. And here's where things took a real quick turn. I go through all that, and once I finish speaking, she asked me, "Is there not just some kind of juice that I can take?" I paused for a second and said, "A juice?" That question kind of stumbled me a little bit because she's been struggling for years and she thinks that I just have some magic juice that she has yet to try. Long story short with this gal, I then went into an even more detailed explanation of headaches and she ended up just hanging up on me. By the way, in case you didn't know, if you head on over to my website, you can schedule a free phone consult with me where we do this very thing. Check out my calendar, find a time that works best for you, and during that time, you can tell me all about what you're struggling with, and I'll do my best to guide you on what I would consider best next steps. But back to this video. In the past, we have discussed the cellular mechanism behind a head injury and something called the neurometabolic cascade. If you don't know what I'm referring to, you can check out this video right here to learn more. But just to give you a brief synopsis, in case you haven't watched or maybe you just need a refresher, during a concussive event, there are molecules whose names aren't really important right now. Just know that there are molecules on the outside of the neuron as well as some on the inside of the neuron. And when you bump your noggin, these molecules switch places. Now, when that occurs, these molecules have to get back to where they came from, and that process requires energy, which leads to what they call an energy crisis. And in this article, they state that in order to rapidly restore ionic homeostasis following mild traumatic brain injury, mitochondria must meet the increased cellular metabolic demand. So what they're saying is that our mitochondria, which are our little energy-producing cells, have to work overtime in order to restore things back to normal. Now, this whole process has been difficult to quantify in humans, but in this article, they state that animal models show that neuronal glycolytic rate increases 30 to 46% in the 30 minutes following fluid percussion injury, aka concussion, and may persist for up to 6 hours. And in other videos, we have discussed how they have shown in human studies through magnetic resonance spectroscopy that this energy crisis could last up to 30 days in the event that you don't sustain another head injury in that time window. With all that being said, I think it's easy to look at a concussion as a biomechanical injury, as in you hit something or someone and your brain gets rattled about within your skull, leading to bruising and stretching and shearing. But I think it's also important to take into consideration this metabolic injury. And the question that I'd like to answer for you in this video is, are there different supplements and dietary interventions that you can partake in to speed this process along? Now, with that being said, let's first cover diet. Finding material that pertains specifically to mild traumatic brain injury, aka concussion, is a little bit more difficult, but in this study that was published back in 2008, they compiled information from 24 different studies, and they found that, for one, this is highly variable, but that calorie expenditure among TBI patients usually increases by 87% to 200% above the usual requirements and may be elevated for 30 days due to the metabolic changes in moderate and severe traumatic brain injuries. Makes sense, right? This neurometabolic cascade that we spoke on earlier requires energy. And your mitochondria that make that energy have to have some substrates in order to produce that energy. Just like how a flower needs sunlight and water in order to bloom, these mitochondria need things in order to continue pumping out energy. Now, don't you think it would be a fairly reasonable thing to do to make sure that your nutrition is on point during this time as you progress through your recovery journey? I mean, it sounds reasonable to me. Now, a couple things that are important depending on the severity of your injury that they discuss is how it may be difficult for TBI patients to reach their full caloric requirement depending on things like, if let's say, for example, you were hit in the face and now you have pain and discomfort of your face or your mouth, or maybe a few teeth got knocked out, or you could just have a loss of appetite, or if it's pretty serious, maybe you even have to plan your meals around surgery. Hopefully you aren't dealing with any of those, but regardless, whether you are or not, your brain is still undergoing this energy crisis. And so we need to increase our caloric intake. And when I say that, I'm not talking about what I've heard bodybuilders refer to as dirty bulking, meaning just eating as much crap as possible in order to fulfill the quota of more calories. All calories are not the same. Your brain is in need of more resources during this time. And so let's feed it some nutrient-dense calories. What does that mean? Well, if you've ever read Michael Pollan's book entitled Food Rules, he uses a motto of eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Let's break that down. By food, he means real food, not creations of food in a factory. Real food doesn't have a long ingredient list, it isn't advertised on TV, and it doesn't contain stuff like maltodextrin or those words that you've never heard of before and are really hard to pronounce. Stay away from those highly processed foods, foods that have lots of added fat and sugar or refined grains. I'm sure you've probably seen the videos of McDonald's chicken nuggets and how they start off as slime. That's not real food. Stay away from stuff like that. And this is good advice not only for recovering from a head injury, but just in general would probably be beneficial. Now, since diet's out of the way, are there any supplements that you can take? Let's find out. First up, we have omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3s are made up of DHA and EPA. So when shopping for different omega-3s, you'll typically find a certain DHA and EPA content that fluctuates with different brands and different products. DHA makes up 97% of all fatty acids found in the brain structure and plays a vital role in brain development, cognitive functioning, and potential role in brain recovery. Also important to state is that the vast majority of us in the Western world have a poor dietary intake of omega-3s, and so supplementing with it is probably not a bad idea even once you have recovered from your head injury. But when pertaining to a head injury specifically, this article states that symptoms of those that were treated with DHA began to resolve on average 16.1 days post-supplementation, 4 days earlier than the placebo group, and similarly, patients receiving a combined DHA and EPA supplement protocol displayed a greater degree of symptom resolution with an average of 12.5 days after their enrollment, with complete resolution achieved by 92.8% of patients within 30 days. Pretty incredible, right? Next up, we have vitamin D. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin and steroid hormone that plays a role in neurodevelopment, neuroprotection, neurofunction, and just overall brain health. So what they did was they took 327 athletes who had recently suffered a concussion and had also been shown to be deficient in vitamin D. They split them into two groups and gave one group an intramuscular injection of vitamin D, and the other group didn't get anything, and then followed them over a 12-week period. After the 12 weeks, they were able to show marked improvements in a number of outcome assessments like the Glasgow Outcome Scale, the Mini Mental Status Examination, and the Clinical Dementia Rating Test in the vitamin D group as compared to the group that did not receive anything, which ultimately allowed them to come to the conclusion that vitamin D supplementation following mild to moderate TBI may improve patients' long-term performance and cognitive outcomes. Next up, let's talk about magnesium. Magnesium is a mineral responsible for cellular and enzymatic functioning. And following mild traumatic brain injury, levels acutely drop in the brain, triggering a cellular crisis. And this decline increases the patient's risk for prolonged symptoms and poor recovery outcomes. So in this study, they took 17 athletes who had recently sustained a head injury, split them into two groups, one getting magnesium along with Tylenol, and the other group only getting Tylenol. And they came to the conclusion that patients receiving magnesium had greater post-concussive symptom severity score improvements. This next one is really cool. It's something called N-acetylcysteine, or some call it NAC. This is really cool because going back to this energy crisis and how the mitochondria is having to work overtime in order to put out more energy, when that does happen, the mitochondria also produces waste products, something called superoxide radical. Now, just like how whenever you eat something, your body will take that nutrients in and utilize whatever it needs out of that food and then excrete the rest as waste. Your mitochondria does the same thing. They take in nutrients like glucose in order to create energy and then spits off a little bit of waste. Why this is important is because just like how you would probably prefer not to have your own waste products on yourself, the mitochondria is the same. When the mitochondria produces this waste, it needs to be collected or quenched through anti-inflammatories like glutathione. NAC serves as a precursor for glutathione, which allows for your body to make and replenish these antioxidant or glutathione stores. In the event that your antioxidant stores are low and the mitochondria produces this waste product, that waste product will go back and attach to the mitochondria, which destroys the whole thing, ultimately leading to a decrease in the amount of energy that you can create. So what they did to find out if NAC would be a good idea was they took 81 military personnel who had been exposed to blast injuries and then were randomly assigned to receive either NAC or a placebo for 7 days. They were reassessed at day 3 and day 7, and they were measuring things like dizziness, hearing loss, headache, memory loss, sleep disturbances, and neurocognitive dysfunction. And what they found was that subjects receiving NAC within 24 hours of a blast injury had an 86% chance of symptom resolution with no reported side effects versus 42% of those who received the placebo. Lastly, let's talk about creatine. Creatine is derived from the amino acids arginine, glycine, and methionine and is important for resynthesizing ATP, particularly during times of increased metabolic demand. This whole time that I have been referring to the energy that the mitochondria is creating, that official name for that energy is ATP. So we already talked about how there's this energy crisis during a head injury, and that, to use their words from this study, creatine seems to be beneficial during times of an increased metabolic demand in order to produce more ATP. With all that being said, there have been small human studies performed as well as studies on rats that seem favorable, and ultimately this article came to the conclusion that although the current evidence is limited, the utilization of creatine supplementation for the management and protection of concussion and TBI appears promising. So maybe it's not the most conclusive evidence, but for me, and hopefully you by now, simply understanding the pathophysiology of what actually occurs within the brain once you sustain a head injury, and also the mechanism of how creatine works, I personally will make the recommendation for my patients. Now, tying this all together, if you're struggling with a head injury and not sure where to start, I have put together a free guide that you can download that will walk you through what exactly a concussion is, the most up-to-date definition of concussion, common concussion myths, assessment tools, and of course, things that you can do today to help initiate your road to recovery. I also have put in there my personal recommendations for the supplements that we discussed today. I hope you like it. Let me know what you think.